This is a lake shore in Kenya. Beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place you would want to sit and watch the water. 10,000 years ago, someone else sat here too. Many people. And then other people arrived. And what happened next left 27 bodies in the ground, in positions that tell a story nobody wanted to find. Hands bound behind backs. Skulls fractured by blunt objects, swung with enough force to kill instantly. Obsidian blades still embedded in bone. A pregnant woman, face down, hands tied, left where she fell. This is Nadaruk, the oldest known evidence of organized intergroup violence in human history. And the question it raises is not simply when did humans first fight. The question is harder than that, more uncomfortable than that, more important than that. Was this inevitable? Were we always going to do this to each other? Or did something specific happen that turned conflict into massacre? For most of human prehistory, the question of war probably did not arise. Not because humans were peaceful by nature, but because the world was enormous, and the population was tiny, and two groups could live their entire existence without ever meaningfully threatening each other's survival. But populations grew, territories overlapped, resources became contested, and the encounter between two groups that once carried the possibility of trade, of intermarriage, of peaceful exchange, began to carry something else, something darker, something that the bones at Nadaruk documented in a language that needs no translation. This is the story of when and why ancient humans stopped fighting each other as individuals, and started fighting each other as armies, and whether anything about that was ever truly inevitable. Violence is ancient, older than humans, older than primates, older than almost anything with a nervous system complex enough to feel threatened. Two animals fighting over food, two males competing for a mate, one group driving another away from a water source. This is not war, this is territorial behavior. And it is so old and so widespread across the animal kingdom that its presence in ancient humans tells us almost nothing interesting or specific about our species. War is different. War requires organization. War requires planning. War requires the ability to coordinate the violence of multiple individuals toward a shared strategic goal. War requires someone directing the violence, someone deciding not just to fight, but when, and where, and how, and against whom, and to what end. War requires, in other words, the same cognitive toolkit that allows humans to plan a hunt, build a shelter, or perform a religious ceremony. Abstract thinking, forward planning, collective coordination, the application of intelligence to organized violence. And that is why the question of when war began is actually a question about when human cognition became sophisticated enough to organize violence at scale, not when humans first hurt each other. When hurting each other first became strategic. In 2012, researcher Marta Mirazan-Lar and her team were surveying ancient lake shore sites in Kenya when they found what nobody wanted to find: the remains of 27 individuals, at a site called Nadaruk, on the western shore of what was once a much larger Lake Turkana. Dated to approximately 10,000 years ago, the injuries were not from accident, not from animal attack, not from the ordinary violence of an ancient world. They were specific, deliberate, multiple, blunt force trauma to skulls, consistent with being struck by clubs or rocks. Stone projectile wounds, arrow or spear tips embedded in bone. Hand bones broken in ways consistent with defensive injuries. The hands raised to protect a head that was going to be struck anyway. And the bindings. Several individuals with their hands positioned in ways only possible if they were restrained when they died. A woman, approximately 9 months pregnant, found face down, hands behind her back, knees bent, in a position that indicates she was bound when she died. She was not a combatant caught in a fight. She was a captive who was killed, which tells you something about the people who killed her, something about their intention, their organization, their willingness to do this to someone who posed no physical threat. This was not a fight that got out of hand. This was planned, executed, carried through to a deliberate conclusion. This was war, 10,000 years ago, at a lake shore in Kenya. But here is the thing about Nadaruk that most people never hear about. It is almost completely alone. If war were an inevitable, permanent feature of human nature, you would expect to find evidence of it throughout the archaeological record. Everywhere humans existed, in every era, in every environment. That is not what researchers find. Researcher Douglas Fry spent years cataloging the archaeological evidence for prehistoric warfare. His conclusion was striking and controversial. For the vast majority of human prehistory, the evidence for organized intergroup violence is almost completely absent. Individual injuries, occasional trauma consistent with personal conflict, yes. But the signatures of war, mass graves, defensive fortifications, weapons designed specifically to kill humans rather than animals, evidence of systematic violent death across entire communities, these appear almost exclusively after 10,000 years ago, after the introduction of agriculture, after the emergence of settled communities, after populations began to grow in ways that created genuine resource competition between groups. Before farming, before settlement, before the world filled up with competing groups all claiming the same land, the archaeological record is not a record of constant warfare. It is a record of mostly separate groups living mostly separate lives, in a world large enough to accommodate everyone. This does not mean prehistoric humans were peaceful. It means war appears to require specific conditions to become systematic, and those conditions did not exist for most of human prehistory. What were those conditions? Here is what changes when humans start farming. Before agriculture, if a conflict with another group became dangerous, you could move. The world was large. Resources existed elsewhere. Mobility was your ultimate defensive strategy. Walk away, find somewhere else. The conflict was not worth the cost of the alternative. After agriculture, you cannot move. Not easily. Not without losing the investment of months of labor already in the ground. Not without abandoning the surplus food stored that will keep your children alive through the winter. Not without giving up the specific land that you have cleared and prepared and learned to use, land that your survival now depends on, in a way no piece of land ever mattered to a mobile hunter-gatherer. The land became worth fighting for, because leaving became as dangerous as staying. And simultaneously, populations were growing. Farming fed more people. More people needed more food. More food required more land. More land meant expanding into territory that other groups also needed. The world that was large enough for everyone, when everyone was mobile and populations were small, was no longer large enough. The margins were gone. What one group had, another group needed. And for the first time in human history, violence against another group was not just emotionally satisfying in the heat of conflict. It was strategically beneficial. It removed a competitor. It freed up resources. It was worth planning, worth organizing, worth doing systematically, worth doing to pregnant women with their hands tied behind their backs. The conditions for war had arrived. One of the clearest signals in the archaeological record that war has arrived is not the evidence of attack. It is the evidence of defense. Because you only build walls if you need walls. You only dig a defensive ditch around your settlement if you have reason to believe something is coming that you need to stop. Catalhoyuk, in what is now Turkey, is one of the oldest known towns on Earth, 9,000 years ago. And its architecture tells a story without a single written word. No doors at ground level. Every building entered through a hole in the roof, via a ladder that could be pulled up when needed. The entire town designed as a defensive structure, not against animals. Against people, against the specific threat of other humans arriving with violent intentions. The walls of Jericho are 11,000 years old, some of the oldest known defensive fortifications on Earth, built with enormous effort, maintained across generations. A community investing significant resources in the specific project of keeping other humans out. Not predators, humans. The walls are the argument. They are the evidence that by 11,000 years ago, in that specific location, the threat from other human groups was real enough, and consistent enough, to justify permanent, large-scale, multi-generational investment in defense. War had arrived. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in the places where populations had grown, and land had become valuable, and the conditions that make war rational had assembled themselves into the familiar and terrible configuration. But here is what the warfare narrative tends to obscure. For every Nataruk, there are hundreds of ancient sites showing evidence of something completely different. Trade between groups. Intermarriage between groups. The peaceful transfer of knowledge, and technology, and genetic material, across vast distances, between people who could just as easily have chosen violence. Researcher Brian Ferguson spent decades building the most comprehensive database of prehistoric violence ever assembled. His conclusion challenged the assumption that war is simply human nature expressing itself. War, he argued, is not a constant. It is a response to specific conditions. When those conditions are absent, war is largely absent. When those conditions are present, war becomes common. And crucially, those conditions are not permanent features of human existence. They are variables, things that change. Things that can, in principle, be arranged differently. Anthropologist Christopher Bohm studied dozens of modern hunter-gatherer societies, and found enormous variation. Some were remarkably peaceful, conflict resolved through negotiation, through separation, through the social mechanisms that groups had developed over thousands of years of living closely together and needing to maintain cooperation. Others were more violent, and the difference almost always correlated with the same variables: resource pressure, population density, the degree to which moving away from conflict was a viable option. When moving away was possible, people moved away. When it was not, things got darker. War was not human nature. War was the cost of running out of room. Here is the uncomfortable thought that archaeologists, and anthropologists, and historians have been circling for a very long time. War is terrible, and war built civilization. Not because violence is good, but because the threat of violence from organized external groups creates pressures that push communities toward specific kinds of organization. A community that faces organized external threat needs a leader who can direct collective defense, needs warriors who specialize in fighting rather than farming, needs surplus food to support those warriors, needs walls, needs systems for deciding who does what and who gets what, needs, in other words, hierarchy, specialization, organization, all the structural features of complex society forced into existence by the need to survive what the group next door was also becoming. Economist Samuel Bowles modeled the relationship between prehistoric warfare and the development of altruism within groups. His conclusion was stark. The more dangerous the external threat, the stronger the internal cooperation. Groups that faced organized enemies developed stronger bonds of mutual support, stronger willingness to sacrifice for each other, stronger social cohesion than groups that did not. War created, inside the group, the very cooperation that made the group capable of war. The horror and the heroism were the same mechanism, running in opposite directions at the same time. 10,000 years ago, at a beautiful lake shore in Kenya, 27 people were killed, methodically, deliberately, by other people who planned what they did and carried it through to its conclusion, and left. We do not know what started it. We do not know what the conflict was about. We do not know if it was the first time these two groups had fought, or the last. We do not know if the people who did this believed they had a choice, or if they felt they were doing what the circumstances left them no option but to do. What we know is that for most of human prehistory, this did not happen. Not at scale, not systematically, not as a strategy. The world was large enough, and populations were small enough, and the cost of organized violence outweighed the benefit often enough, that most humans in most times chose differently. And then something changed. The world filled up. The land became valuable. The margin disappeared. And the cognitive tools that built temples, and composed music, and navigated oceans, and invented language, were turned toward the organization of deliberate, systematic, collective violence. The question was never whether humans could fight. We always could. The question was always what conditions make fighting feel like the only option, and whether those conditions are as inevitable as they sometimes feel. The bones at Natarek do not tell us that war is human nature. They tell us that when specific things are true about the world humans inhabit, war becomes what human nature produces. Change the things, you change the outcome. That has always been true. It is still true now. The question is not whether humans fought. The question is when fighting became war, and whether it had to.